Hello, everyone. I am Ankur, working in JP Morgan Chase, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will share our experience of using CVSS. We will explore the limitation of CVSS, and we will highlight the examples where CVSS fails to truly reflect the severity of security vulnerabilities. We will start with CVSS and its role in managing vulnerabilities. We will highlight 6 operational challenges with the CVSS and discuss our recommendations. We will also spend some time on future direction for a vulnerability assessment and share key takeaways. So let's get started. We are Team JP Morgan. I'm part of vulnerability management team, and Syed focus on security architecture. Here are our contact details. Feel free to reach out with any questions after the sessions. CVSS is current industry standard for scoring security vulnerabilities. It's maintained by First Org, and current version is 4.0. In a typical workflow, we identify and report security vulnerabilities and request a unique tracking number known as CVEID. And then with the help of CVSS, we can get the severity ratings. The given rating helps prioritization, telling which vulnerabilities should be addressed first. CVSS score help us make informed decisions and prioritize vulnerabilities. Organizations often start by fixing critical security vulnerabilities first and then work on lower ranked vulnerabilities. We have highlighted the key metrics which will be used during our session. We have analyzed the last 10 years trend that shows the CVEs disclosures are growing exponentially, and about 18% of these vulnerabilities are rated as critical, needs prioritization. Denial of service attacks are the most common one, followed by code execution vulnerabilities. These are concerning due to their impact on security, availability, and integrity. Now, Syed will take over to discuss the operational challenges. Over to Syed.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? I think so. So I guess we put the title scary enough that everybody showed up and filled up the room, right? So thank you for coming. So I'm going to talk about the 6 operational challenges that we have faced while using CVSS in our work life, right? Again, we are obligated to mention that this is obviously not JP Morgan's view. This is our own view and the research that we have done as part of our work. So we have 6 challenges that we will go through, and we have divided them into 3 groups. The first 2 are things that are challenges that you can identify by looking at vectors within the CVSS, if you're familiar with those, and I'll take you through those. The next 2, we can't really identify them through the vectors, but there are certain patterns that we will put forward, and we don't believe it's fully solved. We have just started the journey, and we will, look at improving it. And the final 2 are actually big, large challenges that we have not managed to solve, and we are bringing to the community to try and help and resolve together. So, having said that, the first one is what we are calling the aggregation pitfall. And this stems from the fact that CVSS actually uses the most well-known CIA triad that is used in security, right? We're all almost used to security CIA triads. We define things in terms of impacting confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And CVSS uses those 3 core items to define the impact of any given vulnerability. But in doing so, there's a side effect that we see. And the side effect is it equally puts weight on all 3 of the matrix. And when you go into CVSS, you can select one of these 3 values in CVSS, either high, low, or none for each of those metric. But because of the overall aggregation and the weighting, what happens is, if there's a vulnerability which impacts a single metric and not the other ones, you are bounded by the formula as to the maximum score you can get. So if there happens to be a situation where there's a vulnerability with only a high for confidentiality and none for integrity and availability, the maximum score you can get out of this is 8.6. But generally, we see that these vulnerabilities tend to be around 7.5. Here's an example. So during COVID, we had a vulnerability released, which was the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability, which actually impacted the availability of the system, right? It had no impact on the integrity or the confidentiality. And the rating that this vulnerability got was only high, around 7.5 score. So the problem with this is many enterprises use the scoring as a way to prioritize the vulnerability and go and fix it. If you end up getting scores which are artificially low, despite having a huge impact, you might not even meet the threshold of fixing it early or quickly. In this case, it was definitely serious because it was during COVID. We were all working from home, and it could really stop the remote working situation in many companies. So is this a one-off thing, or is it common? So we looked at the data, and the data shows that even if you look at the last year alone, there's about 2,500 vulnerabilities which follow this pattern. So they scored high on one of the metric, but the other two had an impact of none. It is very possible that these would be scored 7.5 or below and would not meet the threshold that many companies use to prioritize vulnerabilities. So this is one of the challenges that we have seen again and again when vulnerabilities come through. So what we are proposing is that firstly, people be aware of this situation, right? That there can be low vulnerabilities which can be very highly impactful. And there are certain patterns that you can look for. So for example, if you see those three value combinations, a high and none, none, then that is a telltale sign that this may be happening with this CVE and is getting an artificially low score. And you probably want to look at those specifically to reprioritize them according to your enterprise's appetite. Moving on to the next one. So CVSS score uses a formula, right? And that formula is, if you have read in depth, is fairly simple and yet complicated because it uses a lot of parameters and variables in there which have been fixed. And when we looked at it carefully, we saw that there are certain cases where the score has a bit of a discrepancy in how it turns out the base metric versus the final result. And this discrepancy happens to be very, very small, right? Generally, we get a difference of about 0.1, which is 1%. Now, it seems very, very low and not interesting enough. But what does happen in certain cases that might actually trigger those boundaries at which you are sitting and prioritizing your vulnerabilities. So instead of doing an SLA of 14 days, you might push it out to an SLA of 90 days. And this is why it's good to be aware of the situation that might happen to you. So this is an example. And if you pull up the CVSS calculator, which tells you the score, this is what you would see, that for that particular vulnerability, exactly the same values, the CVE score comes out as 9, but the final results come out as 9.1. Again, this is the particular pattern that causes it. Is this the only pattern that causes it? No. This is the first one we found. There were other patterns which we put in our paper, which were also possibly causing the same issue. And the thing with this one is it's not very, very common, right? So when we looked at the data, we only found a handful of these cases that happened last year, right? That pattern was only 31 times out of all the about 20,000 CVEs published. Now, is that, again, like I said, that is not the only pattern. There are other patterns that causes the same issue, where there is a bit of discrepancy and can cause the number to jump between the boundaries that an organization may be using for their prioritization. So again, like the last one, we're giving the pattern out, and we're asking you guys to be on the lookout for these so that you can match the incoming CVEs against these patterns and see if there are CVEs that are causing these boundary jumps, which are either causing you to put an artificially high amount of resources on it or a low one, right, depending on which way it's going. The third one is missing dependencies. So now we're moving away from actual patterns in vectors that you can look for to things that you can look inside the CVEs for. So the missing dependency is a significant problem. CVSS does not deal well with the fact that some CVEs require dependencies, right? Having the vulnerability not in a system is not enough. You have to have the right conditions for that vulnerability to be exploited. These can be requirements for network and access controls, certain kind of configuration or dependencies, or even user privileges in some cases. So if we looked at this example, this is a vulnerability from Citrix NetScaler, which actually was rated critical by the vendor and can allow for large amount of memory buffer overflow data to be read and session tokens to be exposed to hackers. But this can only happen in certain configuration settings where the item has been configured to be a gateway. So if this does not happen, and if this is not configured as so in your organization, should this be a critical vulnerability? Now, CVSS does not allow us to see or define the dependencies within the CVEs, which can cause an artificially high number and causing resource allocations in the wrong places. Now, we looked at the data again. In 2023, again, this cannot be pattern-based, right? Because there is no specific metric that captures the dependency. It's within the description of the CVs itself. So when we looked at a few keywords, such as configured, when, should, which are indicative of dependencies that need to exist within the environment, we found that a significant number of CVEs, even in 2023, had those keywords, right? It's about 6,000, 7,000 of them. So what we're really looking to do is to get an understanding of how we can work together to form a better approach of extending CVSS to incorporate these dependencies. So going back to what we did, we looked at the 3 keywords, but now and this was last year, to be honest, and now with the advent of LLM and the progress, our next project is going to be to feed all the CVEs through the LLM process and figure out where and how can we identify better the dependencies that are required in each CVE to be executed within an environment, so that we're not allocating resources where it's not required. The fourth one, I'm sure all of you have been using CVSS or prioritization of vulnerability in some sort or another, and this will resonate if you have been using it. So there's a specific metric inside CVSS that requires or can allow you to use to define what is the maturity of the code exploit that exists in the wild. Now this is interesting because when you look at it, it seems a very, very good thing to have. You can define what type of, what is the rating for the exploit that is available. Is it unknown? Is it high? Is it functional? Is it proof of concept? Or is it unproven? And based on that, the score should get adjusted. So the idea is that and there is numerical values associated with it, but the idea is that if you don't know about it, if it's not defined or if it's high, then the score does not get impacted. But if your exploit is unproven, then you multiply the score with 0.91, hence reducing it by 9%. If your exploit is proof of concept, then it reduces by 6%. Good idea, right? Because you reduce the score, you put less emphasis and resources on it. The problem happens is that how do we know what is the maturity of the exploit at any given time? So this information is highly fragmented, right? There is no comprehensive data that tells you what is the current state accurately of a given exploit at any time. And it's obviously a rapid and dynamic environment which keeps on changing. And this is an example. So there was a vulnerability in the Progress software which led to incidents of well-known customers published in the media. And over a period of 10 days, from June 2nd to June 12th, the CVE, the CVSS value thrashed a lot, right? It went from 9.8 down to 9.0, back to 9.3. And this is based on the input that you would have or have known about the quality of the exploit at that time. Now, is this real? We don't know, right? We don't really know the quality of the exploits at any time. We are making a guess. And in reality, tracking this requires enormous amount of effort, right? When we looked at it, when we looked at the reference data sources for how do we find out what is the range of what is the effectiveness of an exploit at any time, there was about over 400,000 data points that you need to read and parse and figure out what is it at any time. Given the situation, the likelihood of you being actually able to capture the rating or the quality of an exploit anytime is very, very low, and it's very difficult to do and execute. So in our case, our recommendation is that until and unless we have specific data sources that can provide the quality of inputs that we need, we should avoid using this. The chances are you are going to lower the score artificially and miss vulnerabilities that should be prioritized higher because of the thrashing that happens within the environment. Moving on to the fifth one. This is where we think it's a hard challenge that has not been solved, right? And it's nothing to do with patterns, but it's to do with things that we know well, but have not been able to capture or associate in our scoring. APTs or threat actors are well known. We know nation state actors. We talk about them all the time. There's about 200 that are in global presence and are tracked at any time. This is an example of Cozy Bear. There's different sources such as MITRE, which tells you the techniques they're using, the industries that are being targeted, the countries that are being targeted, even sources that tell you the CVEs that might be linked to these actors. What we don't have is the ability to incorporate this into the CVSS scoring, right? We don't know how to incorporate this data and improve the scoring and the prioritization. Now, there is ongoing work, right? So, for example, MITRE gives you a bit of information about association of techniques and exploits with actors. KEV publishes exploited CVEs, and recently EPSS has made the most advances in this with trying to come up with an exploitability score for every CVE, which is excellent. What is missing in all of this is how do we incorporate that into the CVSS framework to impact vulnerabilities? So I have a vulnerability score of 9.5. I have an EPSS score of 1.2, right? How do I combine those together? How do we use that information? That is completely missing. And that is a problem that we want to work on in the future. And we think it's a big enough problem that the community needs to pick this up and start forming a solution for, right? So we have advances in EPSS, we have advances in CVSS, but how do we merge them together? The final one is, I think, very crucial given where we are today and the amount of remote working and video conferencing and all the technologies that we use today. Privacy does not come packaged within the CVSS framework. We have confidentiality, but there is no space for privacy explicitly within the CVSS framework. What do we mean by that? Well-known vulnerability that happened back in a few years ago was the Zoom vulnerability. And Zoom, as we know, is widely used by many companies and organizations to work remotely now, right? With about 300 million active users in 2024. So there was a vulnerability in Zoom, which was rated medium, which had the ability to turn on the camera and get users to join any call from the browser without an intervention from the user, right? So these are serious events, not only in terms of confidentiality, but impacting the privacy of participants who are using Zoom. So how do we get CVSS to pay more attention to the privacy impact on people rather than just the confidentiality as a whole? And here is the data that shows that this is lagging behind, right? So if we look at 2023, there's about 20,000 vulnerabilities published, right, with an impact showing in confidentiality. However, there was only 89 cases where we found the word privacy stuck inside the description. And the numbers look even lower if you look to the left-hand side as the trend goes. So yes, there seems to be analysts and reviewers picking up the fact that there is a privacy impact, but it is not prominent within the CVSS framework as to give it the right amount of scoring and prioritization that we need. So this follows the same approach as the APTs, that we need to extend the framework and we need community support to start working on this solution so that we can get to a stage where privacy takes a front row in CVSS. Okay, so this was all about CVSS 3, and like I said, we did this work last year when CVSS 4 was just being launched, but it was not there yet. The data was not available, so we could not do much with it. But when we did, the definitions were there, and the formulas were there, and the specifications were there, although it was in draft at that time, but it was there. So when we looked at the definitions, and it hasn't changed, by the way, when we looked at the definitions and we thought, okay, does CVSS 4 solve all these problems that we are trying to identify? Does it solve the aggregation problem? Does it solve the privacy problem? Does it solve the rest of the problems we talked about? We saw that CVSS 4 did make a lot of advancements. It made a lot of advancements in the area of supplemental metric groups, which were more targeted at safety critical systems. Now that we have self-driving cars, autonomous items going on in our lives, those are the places that the vulnerabilities are targeting. They were not fixing the same kind of challenges that we were seeing, right? And even with CVSS 4, we are likely to be in the same place with the same challenges. Of course, we need to look at a lot more data as the data is coming out, to see if any of those have been truly solved. But from the definition-wise, it does not look like that those challenges have been addressed. So what are we really thinking? So we are thinking that we need an extension. Now, we don't know if this is in terms of extending CVSS itself, add-on framework, or something else. But the things that we think are really missing in this thing is the association of APTs. How do we incorporate the findings that threat actors are actively exploiting a vulnerability? How do we incorporate that into our prioritization? How do we incorporate the fact that companies and enterprises might have environmental dependencies where the CVEs don't matter? Right? How do we give them the opportunity to incorporate that cleanly so that it can be done? It's not that it's not done today. It's done very manually by parsing and deciding whether this applies to you. But how do we put that into the framework? How do we incorporate the privacy bit into the framework so that we're not only worrying about confidentiality as an umbrella, but looking at humans who might have privacy impact? And lastly, this is, I think, an enterprise-wide need. How do we give the framework an approach to say whether it's attached to critical business services or not? Now, I know when we have the FAQ section, we will probably argue that some of these are beyond the CVE itself and goes into the prioritization based on the context of the company or the enterprise where the vulnerability occurs. But that's okay, right? I'm not saying CVS is wrong. What I'm saying is we need extensions to the framework to make it more user-friendly in the environment that it's really targeted for, right? Just knowing the fact that our vulnerability has a score does not work in an enterprise context when we are trying to prioritize vulnerabilities and spend resources on fixing it. So what are the key takeaways that we were looking at? So first two are the challenges that we posed on the aggregation and the problem with the formula. So those can be identified by looking at the patterns that you're looking for within the vectors, which we will publish in the materials. The next two were the problems that we identified around, around dependencies and how can we identify dependencies from the CVE. And the last two are the ones we talked about. How do we extend the framework to account for APTs? And how do we take privacy impact into consideration? So overall, these were our initial findings from the day-to-day operations that we do and our dealings with CVSS. And we felt that it was important for us to publish the findings we had in terms of the patterns that we were noticing and the issues that we were seeing. So, and our ask is for the community to be aware of this and so that we can all work together to extend the prioritization framework of vulnerabilities so that we can do the right impact for vulnerabilities that are coming out in the future. So I'll stop here and take any questions that you have. Thank you. If you could go to I think we need to go to the mic. That's what we were told.
Thank you. Great presentation. CVSS score gives you a starting point, when you have a large number of vulnerabilities. I'm assuming you would have seen thousands or even more.
Yep.
These are definite challenges. How did you if you can share, how did you prioritize your analysis when you have thousands of vulnerabilities and there are these moving points? You can't do automation against them.
Yep. So we can't obviously talk about it in details, but there is a published framework, a patent that was published, which is called the VXSX framework, right? Which takes the VX, which is what the vulnerability score is, and SX is where we see the importance of the resources that might be impacted, right? And we have an approach to combine those two, which is published in the public domain. That's how we, at the enterprise level, prioritize the vulnerabilities. But like you said, it's a constant challenge, right? Because we are also using ratings and boundaries to decide SLAs. And if these kind of problems happen within our space, right, then it's very easy for a vulnerability to go in the wrong bucket, right? Either we are over-prioritizing or under-prioritizing. And this is a constant battle that we have as well. So we have not solved for it, and that's why we are here, right, to talk about it.
Sure. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
There we go. Hi. Thank you very much. Super interesting. Are there any services, and obviously you're not like a Gartner or an IDC here, but are there services that are offering this currently, and are that you would have to pay for though? Obviously I see this is hugely beneficial because it would be open, anybody could use it. But is this something that a large enterprise, not necessarily yours, would already be accessing in other ways?
I'm going to say yes, I'm sure there are. There are companies that are selling Intel information, right, that can be leveraged. But the point I think we're trying to make here is those are for specific cases that you can leverage, right? There's two issues here. One, even if you get an Intel, let's say your Intel was perfect, right, that this APT is exploiting the CVSS. Now I get a score of 9.5 and says this is highly exploited. What is the right statistical way to merge those things, right? CVSS, in my opinion, should be expanded to allow for that merging to happen, to know that this is an industry-wide problem, right? We want to incorporate this data. The framework should allow you to incorporate this data, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. So yes, the data is probably there in some of the cases, but it's the incorporation that you're asking about.
Hi.
Hi.
With the exception of the privacy, wouldn't this be something that would be quantified by the stakeholder-specific vulnerability classification system from CISA?
So say that one more time. I didn't get the question.
With the exception of the privacy that
Yep.
you mentioned, like the criticality for your business of an asset, wouldn't it be quantified by the stakeholder-specific vulnerability quantification, classification?
Yes, it is. Excluding the first two cases, right, which are issued with the CVSS itself, so no. But I think you're talking about the dependency or the critical business services that we talked about, right? So yes, that is true. The number should come from the stakeholder, like I said, right? You should be able to describe what is the impact that you're seeing. But again, the question remains is, we have left it out for everybody to decide for themselves, right? While this is a problem that everybody has. So who is going to take the responsibility to come up with a consistent framework that we can all use to make sure we're doing the right thing, right? So your point is absolutely valid, but that's where we are at, right? How do we make this more executable? Hi.
Hi. You mentioned the versioning. How do you actually handle when the scores are quite apart? I mean, there's some cases where there's a CVSS score 3.1 of 9 or whatever, and the version 4 just says like 6. It's quite confusing, and in terms of prioritization, quite hard to handle. How do you do that?
So I don't know the answer to that question, I'll be honest, right? It's because we have not managed to analyze the data between CVSS 3 and 4, right? When we started looking at this research, 4 was not out there, so we didn't have enough data points. But that is future work that we are going to target. How do we move from 3 and 4, and how do we rationalize that, right? So that I don't have. But when you started the question, I thought you were going in a different direction. Generally speaking, companies will take a view, right? Or enterprises will take a view on whether to use the rating as their bucketing approach, or they're going to go more granular with the score, right? And it really depends on your appetite. Whether you put 6 and 8 in the same bucket, or do you see a difference in them, right? And that would be variable.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
John Naden from CSO magazine, great presentation. I was wondering, do organisations need to get to a certain amount of maturity to have value in your approach? I mean, what happens if they don't even know what applications or services they're running?
That is a great question, right? So that's one of the critics we got when we started doing the research, right? That many organizations don't even fund the way we think about vulnerabilities, right? We have a whole team managing vulnerabilities, thinking about them, working through them, right? Many don't. So yes, I'm going to say that our discussion is probably slightly biased towards those organizations that are looking at. But in general, I think if we do expand the framework to incorporate the things that we are talking about, it probably makes it easier for everybody else as well, right? Because you have a way, you're almost being forced to think about not CVs in isolation, but consider privacy, considering the impact, considering the criticality of the item that is being impacted, right? So we're encouraging it, but yes, spot on. I think we were slightly on the enterprise side. All right, so, oh, one more.
Sorry in advance if you already covered this, maybe I missed, but doesn't the vulnerability exploitability exchange framework that is emerging on the market today answer some, at least partially, some of these questions?
Probably does, right? So one, I've not looked at that. EPSS is the one that we looked at, which is the most prominent one supported by First Org and MITRE at the moment. Again, like I said, it is doing an excellent job of answering the question of what is the exploitability of this CVE based on what's looking at the market. What I don't know is when I get a 1.2 from there and a 9.5 from here versus a 9 from here and a, I don't know, 0.5 from there, how do I combine those two numbers, right? What is the right way for us to combine those two numbers to get to a right prioritization for my vulnerability, right? Again, this is not my own numbers. These are coming from the industry. So we should work towards a framework that combines and helps and supports those.
Thanks. And narrowing the question, don't you have an experience of using the tool set they offer, like attaching applicability of an exploit to a software bill of material, for example, and then exchange this between the system that can work with this bomb? So do you have an experience doing so or not?
So Ankur might be able to answer this question more with SBOMs.
Sorry, I'm not aware of it, right?
Yeah, so we probably want to chat offline about that side. Probably didn't get the question, yeah. All right, if we don't have any more questions, thank you very much for coming and listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.